In this tutorial, we will explore relative pronouns and clauses. Now, in short, relative clauses tell you more information about something in your sentence. Here's an example of a simple English sentence. I saw a man at the party. Now, we can use an adjective to describe a detail about that man. For instance, I saw a tall man at the party. You're going to use a relative clause when the additional information you want to add is far more detailed than a simple adjective could provide. Here's an example of something like that. The main sentence is still, I saw a tall man at a party. But a relative clause introduced by a relative pronoun in English, who, is who was wearing a green suit. There's no adjective that could have told you all that information, and so a relative clause serves to do just that. Now, when we use a relative pronoun, the word who here is referring back to the man. When a relative clause has the person or thing being referred to, we call that thing the antecedent. Now, we can put a relative clause somewhere else. Notice in the first example, who came immediately after the word man, but this example still makes sense. I saw a tall man at the party who was wearing a green suit. In this example, we still logically know that the who goes back to man, because who refers to people. We use which in English as our relative pronoun for more abstract and inanimate things. So, I saw a tall man at the party which lasted until midnight, and we know that here the antecedent is party. Now on to relatives in Latin. One big difference between Latin and English is that Latin has 3 genders. And you're going to see that the correct relative pronoun you use must refer back to the appropriate gender of the noun. Here's a simple sentence in Latin. Rex in aula sedebat. The king was sitting in the palace. Now I'm going to add a relative clause to that sentence. Remember, everything outside this relative clause, introduced by qui and going up to the next comma there, is the main sentence. The main sentence is still that the king was sitting in the palace. But the relative tells us more information. Qui multum aurum habebat. Who had much gold. Qui is the nominative singular relative going back to a masculine antecedent. Notice in this relative clause, who had much gold. The qui here is the subject of this verb. That's going to be important because there are relatives that are not nominative or subjects. Now, a very important point to stress here. Relative pronouns have the same number and gender as their antecedents, but their case is determined by their function within the relative clause. We'll see what that means as we continue this tutorial. Regina, the queen. Now, everything else is identical because you use the same ending for masculine or feminine of these verbs. But notice here, the word for who is now quae. Quae is the nominative singular relative pronoun referring back to a feminine antecedent. The queen who had much gold was sitting in the palace. Here's an example of a neuter. Aedificium is a neuter noun. Aedificium, building. The building is beautiful is kind of the main point. But the relative adds in an additional piece of information. The building, which is tall. Quod is the relative pronoun for nominative, and we'll see also accusative, going back to a neuter noun. So the building which is tall is also beautiful. Now, you noticed quod is a very common word which means because. Keep in mind that same exact word, same pronunciation, same spelling can also mean which when it is the singular relative with a neuter antecedent. Okay, as I said, not all relatives are subjects of verbs. They can be objects. Here's an example in English. Going back to our famous example, I saw a man at the party. I saw a man who was wearing a green suit at the party. In that first example I gave you, who here is the subject of the verb was wearing. Now let's see a relative as an object. I saw a man whom the host had not invited at the party. In this relative clause, you have a subject, you have a verb, and you have an object. The subject is host. The verb is invited, had invited, and the object of that verb is whom. Whom is a relative, and it has as its antecedent the word man. The same thing now we'll see can happen in Latin. The main sentence here, the king is brave. But inside the relative, I tell you some more information about this king. What king is it? It's the king whom I saw in the palace. And the accusative singular relative, going back to a masculine antecedent, is quem. And so inside this little sentence, here's your verb, I saw. Here's your object, whom, quem. In the feminine, we again have main sentence. The queen is clever. What queen? The queen quam in aula vidi, whom I saw in the palace. And again, you're noticing that Latin has different forms of the relative depending on the gender of the antecedent. And again, we have a problem here. You probably learned quam first as a word that meant how or than. Keep in mind that the exact same pronunciation and spelling is now a word that means whom or which. It is the accusative singular relative with a feminine antecedent. Here's an example of a neuter with the relative pronoun as an object. Aedificium pulchra est. The building is beautiful. Which building? The building quod in urbe vidi, the building which I saw in the city. Here, quod is the direct object of the verb vidi, I saw. Here for your reference are the forms of the singular relative pronouns in nominative and accusative. You'll notice, of course, like all neuters, the nominative and accusative are identical. In the next part of the tutorial on relative pronouns, we will explore the plurals and also cases other than nominative and accusative.